The scent of cardamom and toasted yeast was Avery's armor. It clung to her clothes, settled in her hair, and filled the small bakery she'd poured her last dollar and every ounce of hope into. Here, inside the four walls of the Gilded Spoon, she was not the disgraced line cook from the Celestial Grand Hotel. She was the proprietor, the artist, the master of her own small, quiet world. Her hands, dusted with flour, moved with an economy of motion that was second nature, kneading a silken brioche dough on the cool marble slab. The rhythm was a meditation. Fold, press, turn. Fold, press, turn. It was a language she understood better than words. 6 months. It had been 6 months since she'd been dismissed. Not for a mistake, not for a complaint, but for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She'd been prepping for the evening service in the hotel's Michelin-star kitchen when the double doors had swung open. She hadn't looked up, her focus absolute on the microgreens she was arranging with tweezers. But the silence that fell over the usually chaotic kitchen was a physical force. She'd finally lifted her head, and that was when she saw him. He wasn't a guest. He was an owner. Kwon Jin-woo. His name was a whisper in the five-star world, a ghost who funded empires. He stood in the doorway flanked by 2 men who were built like monoliths, his own frame deceptively lean in a suit so black it seemed to drink the light. It was tailored with surgical precision, a dark gray silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. He hadn't looked at the executive chef. He had looked straight at her. His eyes were the color of dark, bitter coffee, and they held an unnerving stillness. He'd said something in a low voice to the hotel manager, a single, clipped sentence. The manager had turned pale. An hour later, her locker was cleared out, and her final paycheck was pressed into her hand with a mumbled apology she barely heard.
No explanation.
Just an exit. Now, the bell over her bakery door chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound. Avery didn't look up immediately, her focus on shaping the dough into perfect, uniform knots. "Be with you in a moment," she called out, her voice warm. The silence that answered was heavier than a customer's patience. It was familiar. A cold dread trickled down her spine, chilling the warmth from the ovens. She slowly raised her head, her flour-dusted hands frozen over the dough. He stood just inside the door. Kwon Jin-woo. He looked exactly the same, as if he'd been carved from obsidian and tailored wool. The suit was different, a deep charcoal this time, but the effect was identical. It was power made manifest. He moved like the room owed him space, his presence shrinking her cozy shop into a cage. The scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp note of cedarwood and something metallic like cold rain, cut through the sweetness of her bakery. It felt like a violation. "Avery Collins," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and devoid of inflection. Hearing him say her name felt like a brand. She wiped her hands on her apron, a pointless gesture of defiance. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but she held his gaze. "What do you want?" His eyes swept over her bakery, taking in the exposed brick, the polished copper pots hanging from a rack, the glass case filled with the morning's work, golden croissants, glistening fruit tarts, plump scones. His expression was unreadable, but she felt scrutinized, assessed, and filed away. "I have a business proposition for you," he said, taking a step closer. His polished shoes were silent on her worn wooden floors. "I'm not interested," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "Whatever it is. I'm busy building a life you tried to destroy." A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed his features before it was gone. "I did not try to destroy your life. I removed a variable from a sensitive equation. Your proximity was a risk I could not afford." "My proximity?" I was making salads, the absurdity of it, the sheer injustice, still burned hot in her chest. He ignored her outburst. "I require a chef for a private dinner. An important one. The compensation will be substantial enough to ensure this bakery thrives for the next decade." Avery laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You fire me without cause, and now you want to hire me? Get out of my shop." He didn't move. He simply watched her, his stillness a form of pressure. This is not a request. My guest is a man of particular tastes. He has a deep-seated paranoia regarding poison. He will only consume a meal prepared by a neutral third party. Someone with no allegiance to me or to him. Someone whose recent professional history shows a clear, public grievance against my organization. The blood drained from her face. She wasn't just a chef. She was a prop. A guarantee of safety because everyone knew he'd wronged her. She was his alibi on a plate. So, I'm your human food tester. You are my guarantee of trust, he corrected smoothly. The dinner will take place in 2 days. At a secure location. You will prepare a 5-course meal of your design. My people will procure any ingredient you require from any market in the world. You will not be harmed. And if I say no... That was when she made the mistake of looking at his hands. They were resting at his sides, but they weren't relaxed. Long, elegant fingers with clean, perfectly manicured nails. The kind of hands that could sign a multi-million-dollar deal or snap a man's neck with equal ease. He didn't threaten her. He didn't have to. The threat was in the air, in the silent men waiting outside in a black sedan, in the absolute certainty in his eyes. He wasn't accustomed to the word no. The world is a dangerous place, Miss Collins, he said, his voice dropping slightly. It would be a shame if the gas lines in this old building were found to be faulty. Her breath hitched. The threat was so casual, so devastatingly simple. Her dream, her sanctuary, turned to ash and rubble. Everything she had worked for gone. He owned her, and they both knew it. The anger was a hot, useless ball in her throat. Fine, she spat out, the word tasting like defeat. I'll do it, but on my terms. For the first time, a genuine glimmer of interest appeared in his dark eyes. Go on. I cook in a kitchen, not a bunker. I need a full, professional setup. My tools. And you will pay me up front. Half now, half when it's done. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. One of the men outside entered, holding a sleek metal briefcase. He set it on her counter, the sound loud in the tense silence. He opened it. It was full of stacked, banded currency. More money than she had ever seen in her life. This is the first half, Kwon Jin-woo said. The kitchen will be to your specifications. A car will pick you up tomorrow evening. Be ready. He turned and walked out, leaving the briefcase on her counter. The bell chimed again, a mocking little song. Avery stared at the money, then at the perfect, uniform knots of brioche dough on her counter. They suddenly looked like fists. She had thought this little bakery was her escape from men like him, from a world of power and secrets. She now understood she hadn't escaped at all. She had just been waiting for the owner to come and claim his property. The kitchen was not in a bunker. It was in the sky. A penthouse apartment overlooking the glittering sprawl of the city, its windows stretching from floor to ceiling. The kitchen itself was a marvel of stainless steel and black granite, equipped with technology she'd only read about in culinary magazines. It was sterile, beautiful, and utterly soulless. It was his. Avery methodically unpacked her knife roll, the familiar weight of her tools a small comfort in this alien environment. 2 of his men, dressed in the same dark suits, stood silently by the entrance. They hadn't spoken a word to her since she'd been picked up in a silent, black car. They were furniture that breathed. He was there, too. Kwon Jin-woo sat at a large granite island in the center of the room, observing her. He wasn't pretending to work or read. He was simply watching his stillness and unnerving, constant presence. She ignored him, focusing on her craft. She began her prep, her movements fluid and efficient. The sharp, clean sound of her chef's knife against the cutting board was the only noise in the vast, silent space. She minced garlic, diced shallots, broke down a whole sea base with practiced ease. This was her power. In the kitchen, she was in control. Hours passed in this tense silence. She worked, he watched. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the city lights beginning to twinkle below. She was searing scallops, the hiss of the hot pan a welcome disruption. "That scent," he said, his voice startling her. "Saffron." She glanced at him. He was staring at the pan, but his eyes seemed distant, focused on something she couldn't see. "It's for the risotto," she said, her tone clipped and professional. Hannah liked saffron, he said, the name spoken so softly it was almost carried away by the extractor fan. She said it tasted like sunshine. Avery paused, her tongs hovering over the scallops. It was the first personal detail he had ever revealed, a crack in the marble facade. She didn't ask who Hannah was.
She didn't want to know.
Getting to know him was a danger she couldn't afford. She simply nodded and returned to her work. But the name hung in the air between them.
Hannah.
Later, as she was plating the amuse-bouche, a delicate tartlet of wild mushroom and truffle, a phone on the island buzzed. Not his personal phone, but a sleek, anonymous burner. He answered it, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. He listened, his face a mask of cold fury. "Where?" he asked, his voice lethally quiet. He listened again. "Take care of it."
"No witnesses."
He ended the call and placed the phone down with deliberate calm. But she saw it, the tightening of the muscles in his jaw, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the counter. The violence he projected was no longer a vague threat. It was here, in this room, a living entity. "There's been a complication," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "Our guest may be more agitated than anticipated." "Does that mean the dinner is off?" she asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. "It means the dinner is more important than ever," he countered. "It means there can be no mistakes. Nothing can be left to chance." This was her opportunity. Her chance to run. She could feign illness, create a distraction, do anything to get out of this penthouse before whatever storm was coming finally broke. His men were by the door, but she was fast, she was smart. She could find a way. She looked at the door, then back at the perfectly arranged tartlets on the plate. She thought of her bakery, of the loan she still owed, of the quiet life she was trying to build. Running would make her a loose end. And she knew what men like Kwon Jinwoo did with loose ends. Staying was survival. But as she looked at him, at the barely concealed rage simmering beneath his cold exterior, she realized it was more than that. It was a challenge. He thought he could control her, use her as a pawn in his dangerous game. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know the steel that had been forged in the hellfire of professional kitchens. She made a choice. Deliberately, she picked up a small container of chive oil. With a steady hand, she added 3 perfect, emerald green drops to each tartlet, arranging them in a pattern that was both elegant and unexpected. It was a minor change, but it elevated the dish from excellent to exquisite. It was a statement. "I am not a pawn. I am a master of my craft."
"And you will see it."
She carried the plate to the island and set it before him. "The amuse-bouche," she said, her voice steady. He looked down at the plate, his eyes tracing the pattern of the oil. He picked up a tartlet and examined it for a long moment before eating it in one bite. He closed his eyes, chewing slowly. When he opened them, his gaze was sharp, analytical. He saw what she had done. He understood the message. He stood up and walked around the island until he was standing beside her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. That scent of cedar and rain enveloped her. She didn't move, didn't flinch. "You are not what I expected, Avery Collins," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her. His eyes held hers, and in their dark depths, she saw something new. Not just assessment, but a flicker of respect. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thing. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with unspoken questions and dangerous possibilities. The guest arrived precisely at 9. His name was Park Min-soo, an older man with a face like a collapsed building and eyes like chips of flint. He moved with the slow, deliberate menace of a predator who had nothing left to prove. His presence sucked the warmth from the room, replacing it with a brittle tension. Dinner was served in a formal dining room adjacent to the kitchen. Avery remained in the kitchen, plating each course, but the doorway gave her a clear view of the table. Jinwoo and Park sat opposite each other, their soldiers standing like statues against the walls. They spoke in low, calm tones, but the air was thick with violence. Every word was a negotiation. Every silence was a threat. Avery felt like she was on a knife's edge. Her food was the centerpiece of this silent war. Park examined every dish with overt suspicion, his man even using a small silver device to test the first course before his boss would touch it. Jin-woo watched, his face impassive, but Avery could see the rigid line of his shoulders. As she brought out the main course, the pan-seared sea bass with saffron risotto, Park turned his flinty eyes on her. "The chef," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Kwan, you have excellent taste." Not just in food, his gaze lingered on Avery, insolent and possessive. It was a test, a deliberate provocation aimed at Jin-woo. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Jin-woo didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Park. He simply placed his fork down, the quiet click of silver on porcelain echoing like a gunshot. "She is under my protection," Jin-woo said, his voice flat and cold as a morgue slab. "Her purpose here is singular. Do not mistake her presence for an invitation." The threat was unmistakable. Park held his gaze for a long moment before giving a thin, humorless smile. "Of course. My apologies to the artist." He picked up his own fork and finally took a bite of the fish. The immediate crisis was over, but something had shifted. Jin-woo had claimed her, publicly. He had drawn a line in the sand with her on his side. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze of tension. As she was preparing the dessert course, a coffee-infused panna cotta, one of Park's men, entered the kitchen. He was younger than the others, with a restless energy. "My boss is very impressed," he said, leaning against the counter, blocking her path. "He's a generous man. He would pay well for your loyalty." Avery kept her eyes on her work, carefully pouring a chocolate sauce. "I'm not for sale." "Everyone is for sale," he sneered, taking a step closer. "It's just a matter of finding the right price. Or the right pressure." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was alone with him. Jin-woo's men were still in the dining room. She glanced around the kitchen, her eyes cataloging her environment not as a chef, but as a survivor. Knives, hot pans, heavy objects. On the stove, a small pot of sugar and water was bubbling away, reducing down to a simple syrup for a garnish. It was nearly at the hard crack stage. Nearly 300 degrees. She acted before she could think. As he reached for her arm, she spun, grabbing the pot. With a sharp cry, she tripped, sending the contents of the pot splashing across the floor, directly in his path. A significant amount hit his expensive leather shoes and the cuffs of his trousers. He roared, a sound of pure agony as the molten sugar seared through the fabric and leather, adhering to his skin. It was a vicious, brutal burn. He staggered back, cursing, trying to pull the scalding material away. It looked like a clumsy, panicked accident. Jin-woo and 2 of his men were in the kitchen in an instant, drawn by the noise. They saw Park's man howling in pain, saw Avery pressed against the counter, her eyes wide with what looked like fear, the overturned pot on the floor. Jin-woo's eyes met hers for a split second, and in that moment, she knew he saw it all. He saw the truth. He saw the small pot, the deliberate angle of the spill, the tactical genius of using a kitchen tool as a weapon that left no evidence. He knew it wasn't an accident. He said nothing to her. He simply gestured to his men, who hauled Park's groaning soldier out of the kitchen. The disastrous dinner was finally over. Park and his crew left shortly after, the deal unsettled, the air thick with bad blood. Once they were gone, the penthouse fell into a profound silence. Avery began to clean her station, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. She had crossed a line. She had deliberately harmed someone. The woman who had wanted nothing more than to bake bread in a quiet town was gone. Jin-woo entered the kitchen. He walked over to where the sugar had spilled, looking at the sticky, cooling puddle on the floor. "My soldiers are trained in dozens of ways to incapacitate an enemy," he said, his back still to her. "None of them are as effective or as deniable as boiling sugar." He turned to face her. His expression was not angry. It was something far more complex, something that made her skin prickle. It was a look of stark, raw appraisal. "I told myself hiring you was a tactical decision," he said, his voice low and intense. "That you were a tool to solve a problem." He took a step closer, closing the distance between them until only a foot of space remained. "I was lying to myself." Avery's breath caught in her throat. This was more intimate than any touch, more dangerous than any threat. It was a confession. "I learned to survive in kitchens run by men who think they own everything in the room," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, but it didn't shake. "You're just better dressed." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, startling thing. "You are more dangerous than any of them." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a kind of dark reverence. He saw the steel in her, and he wasn't afraid of it. He was drawn to it. The fragile truce between their worlds was shattered. The lines were redrawn. Before she could process the shift, his personal phone rang. He answered, and the cold mask snapped back into place. "What is it?" He listened, and every trace of warmth vanished from his face, replaced by an arctic fury. "Park's men," he said, hanging up the phone, his eyes locked on hers. "They're not at his estate. They're heading out of the city, towards your bakery." The enemy was no longer targeting him. They were targeting her. The ride back to her small town was a silent, high-speed blur. Avery sat beside Jean-Woo in the back of the armored sedan, two other cars flanking them in a tight, professional formation. The world outside the tinted windows was dark and indistinct. Inside, the tension was a physical presence. He hadn't spoken since the phone call, his entire being coiled with a predatory stillness that was terrifying to behold. Her bakery.
Her sanctuary.
They were going to destroy it to get to him. The violation of it made her sick. That place was all she had, the one corner of the world that was truly hers. As they neared the town, the lead car slowed. Jean-Woo's head of security, a man named Choi, spoke into an earpiece. Two vehicles parked across the street. For men, possibly more inside. No sign of forced entry. They're waiting. Jean-Woo looked at her. "They think you're alone. They think you're weak. They will try to take you. They will use you as leverage against me." "I'm not weak," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. His gaze was intense. "I know," he turned to Choi. "Standard formation. We go in through the back. Neutralize the targets inside. I want the leader left for me." The cars peeled off into a dark alley behind her bakery. The men moved with silent, brutal efficiency, fanning out into the darkness. Jean-Woo pulled a sleek, black pistol from a holster under his jacket, the movement so smooth it was like he was born with it in his hand. He looked at her. "Stay in the car. Do not get out for any reason." He opened his door and was gone, swallowed by the night. Avery's heart pounded in her ears. Stay in the car. Be the damsel. Wait to be rescued. The thought was infuriating. This was her home they were invading. Her life they were threatening. She watched as his men breached the back door. Muffled sounds followed, a crash, a grunt, but no gunshots. They were being quiet, professional, but she knew her bakery. She knew its layout, its quirks, its hiding places. She knew the loose floorboard near the pantry and the weak latch on the cellar door. She knew its secrets. They didn't. She made a decision. Taking a deep breath, she opened the car door and slipped out, hugging the shadows of the alley. She crept to the back door, which was now ajar. Inside, she could hear the sounds of a struggle. Peeking around the frame, she saw one of Park's men had gotten the jump on one of Jean-Woo's. He had a knife to the man's throat. Without thinking, Avery acted. She grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, a heavy, cast-iron skillet hanging on a hook. It was heavy and familiar in her hand. She moved silently, her soft-soled shoes making no noise on the flour-dusted floor. The man was focused on his hostage, his back to her. She swung the skillet with all her strength, connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Jean-Woo's man stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and something akin to awe. She just nodded, her knuckles white around the handle of the skillet. The fight was over in moments. Jean-Woo's team was ruthlessly efficient. She found him in the main shop, standing over the leader of the group, who was bleeding from a cut on his face. The man glared at Jinwoo with pure hatred. "You'll never be free of Park," the man spat. "He'll take everything from you, starting with her." Jinwoo didn't answer. He simply looked at the man with cold, empty eyes before delivering a single, precise strike that silenced him for good. The violence was so swift, so casual, it stole her breath. The aftermath was quiet and surreal. His men were cleaning up, removing the bodies, erasing any sign of the fight. Jinwoo walked over to her. She was standing in the middle of her wrecked shop. Bags of flour were split open, chairs were overturned, the glass of her display case was shattered. Her dream lay in ruins around her. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the skillet still clutched in her hand, then at her face, smudged with flour. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer empty platitudes. "My world is not safe," he said, his voice rough. "Neither is mine," she replied, her gaze sweeping over the destruction. "I just hide it better." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the heavy skillet from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, warm contact in the cold room. "This life," he said, looking around the bakery, "this quiet life you wanted, it's over. As long as you are connected to me, they will never stop." The cost. This was the cost. Her bakery, her independence, her hope for a normal life. All of it, sacrificed on the altar of his world. A wave of grief and anger washed over her, so sharp it almost brought her to her knees. "You are a liability," he continued, his eyes locking with hers, dark and serious. "A complication I did not plan for. You are a weakness my enemies will try to exploit." He paused, and the silence stretched, heavy with unspoken meaning. "And you are a liability I find I am unwilling to part with." It was the closest he would ever come to a declaration. It wasn't about love or affection. It was about possession, about a claim, forged in violence and mutual respect. He was acknowledging what she was to him, no longer hidden, no longer deniable. He took her back to the city, to the cold, sterile penthouse that felt more like a fortress than a home. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of construction. She walked out into the main living area. A team of workers was there, installing something in a room she hadn't noticed before. Jinwoo was standing by the window, watching the sunrise. He turned as she approached. "Your bakery is being repaired," he said. "It will be better than new. But you can't go back there. It isn't secure." She followed his gaze to the room where the workers were. They were installing a kitchen. Not a simple residential kitchen, but a full, state-of-the-art professional setup. Gleaming steel, a 6-burner Vulcan range, a convection oven, a marble prep station. It was a chef's dream. It was a gilded cage. He walked her to the entrance of the new kitchen. It was a promise and a prison, all in one. "Work," he said. The word was not a command. It was a plea, an invitation to find her footing in this new, dangerous reality he had dragged her into. It was the only peace he knew how to offer her. Avery stepped into the kitchen. The air smelled of fresh paint and new metal. One of the workers had left a brand new chef's knife on the counter, still in its packaging. She picked it up, unwrapping it. The blade was German steel, perfectly balanced, the handle fitting into her palm as if it were made for her. She tested its weight, the cold, lethal potential of it. She looked from the knife in her hand to the man standing in the doorway, the man who had destroyed her life only to build her a new one in his own image. She had made her choice the moment she picked up that skillet. She had chosen survival. She had chosen him. With a slow, deliberate motion, she turned toward the counter, the knife held ready in her hand. It was time to cook.